Hello and welcome to another TLDR Explains video. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at the digital currency that China introduced recently, DCEP. We're going to explain what the new currency is, why it's been introduced, and how it might fundamentally alter the financial order. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more news updates from us. Also, if you're looking for more non-coronavirus content, we've just put up a video on the TLDR EU channel where we discuss the Russian oil spill in the Arctic Ocean. There's a link to that video in the description. So in April, at the peak of the coronavirus coverage, China announced a closed pilot scheme for a new digital currency, known as the Digital Currency Electronic Payment, or DCEP, in 4 cities and the future site of the 2020 Winter Olympics. Government workers were reportedly paid 50% of their transport subsidies in DCEP in order to introduce it into circulation. And while the Chinese government insists that there's no official timetable, it's clear that China's keen to introduce a digital currency as soon as possible, and it's notably far ahead of any other major economy in this respect. The People's Bank of China has been thinking about some sort of digital currency since 2014, and the Digital Currency Research Institute, which is in charge of digital currency development and testing, was first inaugurated in 2017, when it invited major state-owned commercial banks and other influential institutions to help them with the design of the DCEP system. So what exactly is DCEP? Well, the easiest way to think of it is as a digital version of the yuan, China's currency. Its value is tied 1-to-1 with the yuan, and works on a 2-tiered system. The People's Bank of China issues DCEP to smaller commercial banks, who then in turn issue digital wallets to customers, which are accessed via a smartphone app authorized by the People's Bank of China. Some have described the DCEP as a cryptocurrency, and while that's sort of true, it's unlike most other cryptocurrencies in the fact that it doesn't use blockchain technology, and obviously is very centralized. On a more philosophical note, the DCEP is also unlike other cryptocurrencies, in that it obviously conforms to a traditional theory of currencies. There are 2 classical theories of money: metallism, which holds that money derives its value in relation to some precious metals, i.e. silver coins or currency tied to the value of gold, or Chartism, which holds that money derives its value from the fact that it will be accepted by the state as taxation. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin obviously don't conform to either of these, which might go some way to explaining their volatility. But DCEP does conform to the Chartist theory of money, in that the Chinese state accepts it as taxation. DCEP has 3 interesting advantages over usual mobile payment systems. Firstly, and most obviously, using a wallet issued directly by the People's Bank of China cuts out any third party. At the moment, there's a whole infrastructure of third-party private companies who facilitate mobile payment. Think Apple and Google Pay in the UK and WeChat Pay in China. If the state decides to facilitate this instead, this removes the need for any private infrastructure, which should in theory mean lower transaction costs for businesses which use mobile payments. Similarly, at the moment, if you run a business anywhere in the world, you have to pay a card network like Visa, MasterCard, or American Express. So if the state decides to do this for free, that cuts out the cost. The DCEP also works without an internet connection. This is because if China really intends the DCEP as a replacement for physical cash, it has to work offline for 2 reasons. Firstly, so that it can be adopted in rural communities, and secondly, so it can still function as a medium of exchange if there's some sort of technological blackout. Otherwise, if everyone replaced physical cash with DCEP and there was some sort of temporary network failure, even for a short amount of time, the economy would have no medium of exchange, which it goes without saying would be a bit of a disaster. The final advantage for DCEP is that it's more hygienic than cash. In the wake of the coronavirus, some shops in China stopped accepting cash for fears of infection, and the Chinese central bank actually destroyed $6 million worth of paper money collected from the worst affected regions for hygiene purposes. Obviously, the DCEP wouldn't have any of these problems. But while it has some advantages for the user, the DCEP brings with it some obvious privacy issues. DCEP tells the state everything it wants to know about how you spend your money, from how much you spend at the hairdressers to how many times you go out to eat. And if China wants its digital currency to be used anywhere outside of China, it will have to guarantee users some degree of privacy. At the moment, the Chinese government claims that users have controllable anonymity, and the former Bank of China president said that the technology will allow for some anonymous transactions, although there will be limits on the frequency and amount of money involved, but there aren't any specific details on this yet. In truth, the DCEP is mainly of benefit for the state, not for citizens. DCEP, and for that matter any sovereign digital currency, have two massive advantages for the state. They allow for better monitoring of the economy and guarantee monetary sovereignty. If a state can access information about literally every transaction that goes on in the economy, it should, in theory, be more able to anticipate and understand economic booms and busts to avoid economic crises and therefore guarantee a more stable currency. It also means that the state would be better equipped to stop tax evasion, money laundering, and even terrorist financing. This is why being able to minutely monitor all economic activity is a massive advantage for the state. It allows for more control of the economy, more effective monetary policy, and better enforcement against illegal economic activity. But this does come with a privacy cost for the users. The other major advantage, monetary sovereignty, is a bit of a new thing for states, and it requires a bit of context. Basically, monetary sovereignty is the power of the state to exclusively control their own currency in two main ways: by defining what counts as legal tender, and then being exclusively able to issue and retire this tender. It's a bit more complicated than this, but the essential point is that for a state to exercise monetary sovereignty, it needs to have control over the currency that's being used within its borders. Many states have seen an advent of digital currencies and cryptocurrencies as a possible threat to its sovereignty, especially Facebook's Libra. Libra was originally pitched as Facebook's way of cutting international friction costs, with the value of Libra being tied to a basket of traditional currencies, which is just a mix of several currencies with different weightings. Any Facebook user could send Libra to another user, making cross-border transactions super easy. This might sound like an innocent enough idea, but many states, China especially, see Libra as a threat to their monetary sovereignty. The risk is obvious in fragile states, which don't have a stable currency. Citizens might just give up on their national currency and use Libra instead, giving the state no control over the currency being used in its border. But as the French finance minister argued in an article in the Financial Times last year, Libra poses a threat to monetary sovereignty in developed countries as well. As we mentioned, Libra would originally derive its value from a basket of other currencies. But if Libra were to become popular enough, the relationship could become reversed. These other currencies could derive their value from their association with Libra. Le Maire argues that if this became the case, Facebook could dramatically alter the value of a currency by changing the weighting of that currency within the basket. This would essentially give monetary power to a private company with no democratic accountability, which would be a world first. Speaking of Facebook's accountability, there's a link in the description to our video where we discuss what's being dubbed as Facebook's new Supreme Court. Anyway, so that's the context. Now, the obvious way for states to dampen this threat is to get there first. If China can succeed in getting not just China, but much of Asia and Africa to take up the digital yuan, which would mean nice and easy cross-border transactions, this would make Libra sort of redundant, which means that digital currencies are a sort of monetary sovereignty guarantee against private cryptocurrencies. Finally, there's one China-specific reason for the digital yuan. The previous two reasons for digital currency, more monetary control and monetary sovereignty, are universal. Every state wants monetary control and monetary sovereignty. But China has a third reason. It hopes that the digital yuan might help the yuan unseat the dollar as the world's reserve currency. This is quite economicsy, so we're not going to go into too much detail here. But basically, the US dollar is the world's favourite currency. It's used for most transactions, Nearly 40% of the world's debt is denominated in US dollars, and the dollar makes up 60% of central bank foreign exchange reserves, hence the name reserve currency. This is why the US can essentially print as much money as it wants without any real inflationary consequences, because everyone wants more dollars. This was evident over the coronavirus pandemic, when, in an unprecedented move, the Federal Reserve bought up risky corporate debt in the form of high-yield bonds. If any other central bank did this, they'd almost certainly see an increase in borrowing costs. Anyway, the point is that the US's status as the world's reserve currency gives America a massive economic advantage over other countries. So China hopes that if the digital yuan becomes popular enough, it might allow the yuan to compete with the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and therefore end America's financial hegemony. So that's the digital yuan. In a way, it's a political enterprise to undermine the dollar's dominance and defend monetary sovereignty against private companies. But it should also be seen as a sort of inevitability. China knows that digital money is the future, and it's just getting there first. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you'd like more videos on China or more economics videos, then do let us know, and we'll try and accommodate that. Also, as I said at the start, be sure to check out the video we made on Russia's oil spill, as it's super interesting to explore not just the spill itself, but also the environmental factors that caused it, factors which could prove difficult for Russia to handle in years to come. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more updates on topics like this, and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we post. Special thanks to our Patreon backers, who make videos like this one possible.